Amen.
Amen. Okay, Stephen.
Yeah. Hi. Good afternoon, everyone. And what time is it in Melbourne? Like 7 p.m. I think, something like that.
5:30 at the moment,
Oh,
so not so
5:30
bad.
only. One month. Okay. Um, we're covering the book of Ezra-Nehemiah, and I see that most of us here are rather mature in the sense that we've been Christians for many years. So I trust that nothing in this lecture this week and next week would shake your faith in Jesus Christ, but it may shake some paradigms. But your faith, since your faith is secure in Christ, then I feel at liberty to talk about this book, Ezra-Nehemiah. This week we're going to cover a bit of a backgrounding work as well as structure of the book. I think that no other book in the Bible is more background heavy as the book of Ezra-Nehemiah. Now, why did I use the singular word book, Ezra-Nehemiah, instead of the book of Ezra and the book of Nehemiah? Is because historically it's one book. They usually call this just the book of Ezra. Um, and somewhere in the so throughout the Old Testament period, this has always been one scroll, one book, and in during the times of Jesus and the apostles, it is also one book. Down through the church fathers and the early Middle Ages, we begin to see these books split into two. The way that we find it in our English Bibles is during sometime 8th, 9th century. So it's rather late in the history of transmission that this book gets split into two. But actually, the author or authors or editors intended this book to be read as a single book and didn't know that it would be split into two. So we call this Ezra-Nehemiah today. Right, so how do we end up here? If you read the first sentence of the book of Ezra, chapter 1, verse 1, in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled. The Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom and also put it in writing. Wow, this first sentence alone would make little sense to someone who, who's say new in the faith, new to biblical literature, because there's just all these characters that the author assume that you know, right? The author assumes that you know who Cyrus, king of Persia, is, and you know exactly what the Lord said by the mouth of Jeremiah the prophet. Okay, what exactly is needed to be fulfilled, and and so on and so forth. So basically, in order to read this book, a lot of historical background is not only needed but assumed. Assumed. The author assumed that you must know all this stuff already. Then you begin to read his work. So that is what we are trying to do today. We're going to begin with some history, and I'll approach it as a historian, of course, because this is history, and that this recounting of history may differ somewhat from the way that you are used to hearing the history of Israel. So can't go back way too far to Abraham or whatever. We begin in the kingdom period. So we have King Saul as the first king of Israel, and then who failed to establish a dynasty. He was he was basically killed in a battle. So also his son, and so therefore the throne fell to a popular leader by the name of David, who did manage to establish a dynasty. And uh, I'm going to talk a bit more about the religious setting. So of Israel, Israel's religion, we always assume Israel religion is Yahweh, is as their God, but that is because we're reading the Bible, and the Bible is produced by a group of people who are Yahweh exclusivists. They are a group of people who are completely devoted to the worship of Yahweh. But that is not necessarily the case with the whole country. So if you ask what is the religion of a typical Israelite, would be that of polytheism, basically. They would worship the gods, much to the chagrin of the Yahweh exclusivists. That is why you read in the biblical literature that Israel always worship the Baal and Asherah, and basically the gods of the neighbors. Now, an Israelite would always recognize Yahweh as the national deity, the national god of the people of Israel is Yahweh, but it's not monotheism, as in he is the only God, just that he is our God. But then there are other gods that the Moabites worship, that the Edomites worship, that the Assyrians worship. So most people were not Yahweh exclusivists. So the Yahweh exclusivists were a small minority, but educated minority. And you say maybe they are the priests in the temple of Jerusalem. Not necessarily so. If you read the way the prophets talk about, and also the kingdom historian talk about the count of the temple in Jerusalem, you can see that often, maybe for most of its history, it is not a Yahweh exclusivist temple either. Just as if you go to a local temple of Guan Yin, let's just say, well, Guan Yin may be the main goddess that is being worshipped, but then there will be other gods and goddesses that will also be worshipped, although it is acknowledged that this is the temple of Guan Yin. She's in charge here, but these other deities are also worshipped as well. And so therefore, and we have archaeological evidence where they will say that this particular item that they have is dedicated to Yahweh and his Asherah. So what does that mean? Is that some Israelites thought that Yahweh is God, it's our God, and Yahweh's wife was Asherah. So basically, that is the kind of thing, right? Yahweh and his consort Asherah, and so, but throughout history of Israel, there had always been a minority voice, prophetic voice, that claims that Israel ought to be exclusivist, and they often pay a heavy price for that because it's often looked at as an extremist view, as a non-inclusive view, as a rather, in today's terms, right, it will be rather a bigoted view, right? Why only one God, this God? Why not be more liberal with religion? Why force everyone to believe the same thing? So by and large, the religion of Israel is very mixed, you could say. The country was eventually split into two, to northern Israel and southern Judah. Jerusalem is in Judah, so that's where the temple of Yahweh is. So that caused the kings of Israel to consider the idea that the cult of Yahweh is primarily in southern Judah. So that makes it very dangerous for the northern kings. So what they did was that they put they have two temples of their own, one in the north of the country, one in the south of the country. The north of the country, Dan; the south of the country, Bethel of northern Israel, so that you don't have to cross the border either to the north to worship the gods of to Syria to worship, or you don't have to go down south to Judah, to Jerusalem, to worship Yahweh. You can do all that by worshiping in the land of northern Israel itself. So that these competing temples in the land of Canaan for that entire period of time. So the Assyrians, who was interested to conquer Egypt as usual, because Egypt is where the food is. Whoever controls Egypt really controls food, grain. So and to go south to Egypt, you need to pass through northern Israel and southern Judah. So for a period of time, northern Israel and southern Judah, they competed with each other, often at war, but also often they were allies because of external threats. But the Assyrian managed to conquer northern Israel, and the capital city of northern Israel, Samaria. And so what happened was that several things. There was a deportation of local Israelites into other places of Assyria that the Assyrians have conquered, and the Assyrians brought in people outside, of foreigners to intermingle with the Israelites, so that it would dilute the national identity. So the Assyrians' strategy of imperial strategy was to dilute national identities, so that people would not cooperate when we have. So it's a divide and conquer by creating but their goal was also to create a blended culture. That was what their goal was. And so there was further mixture of the Yahweh religion of the north, already very diluted, but further diluted further with influences from outside. No doubt, many refugees would come down from northern Israel to southern Judah. Just as now Ukrainians who are Slavs migrating to other Slavic countries as refugees. So also the wars of the conquest of northern Israel resulted in some major migration south, and that migration also brought with them, of course, the religious practices of the north to the south as well. So there's a melding of culture, of identity of the north and the south. Several kings of the south thought that maybe the best way, and because the Assyrians failed to conquer southern Judah, they eventually, the empire itself was by failing to conquer southern Judah, they never made it to Egypt. Eventually, the Assyrians themselves had a kind of like a downfall, and so the new superpowers of the day were Babylon and Egypt in the southwest, Babylon in the northeast, and the kings of southern Judah had to make decisions as to how are they going to. So you're going to play both sides, right? Are you? Depends whether you're because they're stuck in the middle between Egypt and Babylon. So are you NATO? Are you Russia? Right? So that kind of thing is real. It was real for Israel, whether they are on this side or that side. So some kings favor to go under Egypt. Some other kings favor to go under Babylon.
Okay.
some other kings, they want to assert independence, right? So we are neither northeast Babylonian or southwest Egypt. I want to rule my own country. And often those kings who want to rule their own country and not bend to Egypt or Babylon, they would be naturally become Yahweh exclusivists, right? Because we get rid of the foreign gods, right? So that we establish a Yahweh exclusivistic national identity for ourselves. So kings like Hezekiah, kings like Josiah, who tried to enforce Yahweh exclusivism. But of course, national policy is national policy. How it is practiced in the general population is a different story altogether, isn't it? That is why the kingdom historians say that although this particular King Hezekiah, King Josiah, they're very good, all right, tore down these things, but then, there's still these high places where people worship, because that's just the religion that was a rather polytheistic religion that was passed down from generation to generation with family altars and all of that. So often the kings would sway towards Egyptian, often the kings would sway towards Babylonian, depending who is stronger, 50 years south, 50 years north, something like that. And some assert independence, and the natural way to do that is, okay, Yahweh exclusivism, and try to get rid of foreign gods. But that all came to a crushing end in 587, where the king of Israel, the king of Judah, made a blunder. He was advised by Prophet Jeremiah to remain loyal to Babylon, because at this time Babylon was really strong, and the king of Judah, the kingdom of Judah has already made a covenant with Babylon to pay tax to Babylon. But the king thought that he could make a political move here by switching allegiance to Egypt, and Egypt said, yeah, if you switch allegiance to us, we will protect you. So there was a Egypt-Judah alliance against Babylon. Babylon didn't like that, right? And so sent their army under King Nebuchadnezzar. And the Egyptians either didn't show up, or for some reason, right, or maybe they have weakness of their own, or they have problems of their own. And so the Babylonians won. And the Babylonians didn't thought it wise to destroy the monarchy, because they don't want to make it their own problem, right, to govern this place. They just want to make sure that they control the place, pay tax to them, and becomes a buffer zone between Babylon and Egypt. That's all the Babylonians wanted, right? We have a buffer nation between us and the Egyptians, right? And it's better if the buffer nation is loyal to us rather than to the Egyptians. So what they did was they exiled the elites, especially the children of the elites. That is, we can find evidence of that in the book of Daniel, where the children of elites were taken. Why I think the children of elites is because they are political hostages. If there's any rebellion by the Judahites, then it will be a rebellion by the elites and by the political class. And so by taking their children, there's a few good strategy why you want to do that. Number one is that they are hostages. If you rebel, well, we'll kill your children. Number one. Number two would be that we want to educate them in the Babylonian way, the Babylonian culture, so that when we send them back to their parents, all right, to take over to be the next generation of political rulers, they will be thoroughly Babylonian, right? Their culture obey Babylon. So that was the first wave of exile. There's a second wave of exile, and then when even that didn't prevent a subsequent king of Judah to rebel against the Babylonians. So Nebuchadnezzar have had enough, right? And came in 587, 586, and destroyed the monarchy altogether, and had a more general exile of the southern Judahites, of the Jerusalemites especially. Jerusalem was destroyed, and the temple was destroyed. So that ends one historical period of Israel. The kingdom comes to an end. But who got exiled? Did they exile every single Judahite? Of course not, right? What's the point of doing that? So they're left behind the laity population, I would say, the farmers, right? The gardener, they leave those because the more they pose no threat. Number two, you don't want that place to be unpopulated, then the Egyptians will come. So you leave a population there, and you appoint a governor over the province. Who's basically a Babylonian governor. That is what you would do. So therefore, there is a minority of Judahites that got exiled to Babylon, and the rest remained in the land. It's a very important concept, right? There's a large group that remain in the land. Now, over in Babylon, people like the prophet Ezekiel, okay, and they start to think, like, what happened to us? Has God abandoned us? What happened to the covenant that God made with Israel? Did God lose to Marduk, the god of the Babylonians, or what is going on? So the author of Daniel would say that is not the case. Rather, it is Yahweh gave us up to the Babylonians, right? Instead of Yahweh was defeated by the enemy, Yahweh has a plan, and we are exiled because of our sins. We have sinned against him. And what would be our primary sin? Our primary sin would be we have mixed our religion with foreign religions. We haven't been Yahweh exclusivists. So during the exile, many people would want to listen to someone like Ezekiel because he has an answer to their problems. Why are we here, right? That's the question. Why are we exiled? What went wrong? And there are other prophetic groups, which Ezekiel called them false prophets. They would say that it is because of this reason, that reason, whatever reason. Whereas Ezekiel says, no, the reason why we are here is because we have mixed our religion with foreign religions. So we need to, if we ever want to get back into the land of Israel, we will need to purify ourselves and become Yahweh exclusivists. And that message became rather popular in where? In Babylon. Understand? That idea was not that popular in the land of Israel itself, in the land, right? That idea gained more support among the people while they were at Babylon. Now the Jews that were exiled many places, some of course remained in Judah, others were exiled to Babylon, others went to Egypt, and in Egypt they have their own Jewish community in Egypt, right? So we have evidence. There was a Jewish temple in a place in Egypt called Elephantine, and we have inscriptions for Elephantine whereby we see that it's more like a continuation of the religion of the mixed religion of southern Judah, and some Egyptian element as well. So they will say that in this temple in Elephantine, Egypt, half the worship goes to Yahweh, one quarter goes to another, to a goddess, another quarter goes to another god. So basically, that has always been the predominant religion of original general, the Israelites in general, right? So the Jews that got exiled to Egypt continued their thinking. The Judahites that remain in Judea would continue their own understanding of religion, but the exiles in Babylon, many of them begin to develop a very strong monotheistic faith, where Yahweh is our God and Yahweh is the only God. No compromise. That compromise is what got us exiled in the first place. And because they no longer have the temple, so when they come together for religious service, what do they do? Right? Because there's no more sacrifices to be done. So when they come together in their communities, so what becomes central? The cultic sacrifices and all that procession, right, is no longer central. So what came to the center was the word. So the Torah became the stories of the Torah. Who knows how far it dates back? All these stories, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, and so on and so forth. These are stories that they have, narratives that is part of their cultural background, and probably written down, but it reaches its final form sometime during the exile. So therefore, when you read the Pentateuch, you can almost hear the voice of the exiles in it, right? You can hear echoes of it. It is generally dark, the Torah, and also the kingdom historian. So the kingdom historian and let's call that the history of Israel. We have Joshua, we have Judges, we have Samuel, we have Kings. They are all following the perspective. They're all written from the perspective of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy say that if you obey God, you will be blessed. Deuteronomy 28. But if you disobey God, you will be cursed, right? Curse will come upon you. So that Deuteronomic worldview provides the explanation of why we ended up in exile. So Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings are written from that perspective. Therefore, whatever the king does, right? Some of these kings, they really did magnificent stuff, excellent stuff, and they were really good kings. But in the pronouncement of the kingdom historian, of the Deuteronomist, is that he's a bad king. Why was he a bad king? Because he didn't worship God wholeheartedly, right? He didn't worship Yahweh wholeheartedly. So then the kings are evaluated based on whether they have been faithful to Yahweh or not. Because it's an explanation of why we ended up in exile. I mean, but this king, he really did so many good things in the past, but it's all in the past. That kingdom is no more, right? So no matter this king, he did, but then that kingdom is no more. It's irrelevant to us. So what is relevant to us is whether they have been faithful to Yahweh or not. So that really controlled their mindset. Following, so and the prophets gave an expectation that we will one day, if you read in Jeremiah, whereby Jeremiah sent them a letter, say that it's going to take a while. You need to stay in exile, build houses, get married, have children, right, and work for the betterment of the city, seek the welfare of the city that you're living in, because it's not going to be so soon. But one day when you come back, you will rebuild the temple. We read in Ezekiel, there is this promise that you will rebuild the temple, chapter 40 to 48. When you rebuild the temple, then Yahweh will return to the temple. Ezekiel himself, he said that he saw a vision of Yahweh. He was in Babylon. The time the temple wasn't destroyed yet. He's in one of the early exiles. And then suddenly by the river, he saw the chariot of God coming, right? Something like the likeness of the glory of the Lord, right? That comes to him, and then he was like, whoa. Then he's basically asking the question, what is Yahweh doing here in Babylon, in the east? Shouldn't Yahweh be in Jerusalem, in the temple? So then the Lord told him what happened back in Jerusalem, where people have become so idolatrous. The temple has become an idolatrous place. And so God find that this is not the place that I want to dwell anymore. And we see that God leaving stage by stage from the temple, right? He leaves, and then eventually he left the temple, was at the Mount of Olives on the east. So that, and you travel further from Mount of Olives, you eventually reach Babylon. That is why Ezekiel saw the glory of the Lord. So then, chapter 42, you build a temple, the glory of the Lord will return to the temple. All right, you lost the glory of the Lord. The glory of the Lord will come back once you rebuild the temple, and nations will come to worship Yahweh. This is especially true in the book of Isaiah, whereby Isaiah 11 we have this. So the root of Jesse and all the nations were basic. So there is an expectation that when that happened, we are going to have a golden age. When we go back to Jerusalem and we rebuild the temple, Yahweh will come back to the temple, and then we're going to spark a golden age. The Messiah would arrive, right? And the Messiah will come and brings a golden age to Israel, and we will finally fulfill the commission that God gave to Abraham, that is to be a blessing to all the nations. So all the nations would come to Jerusalem to worship God at the temple. So it is a multi-ethnic, international vision, a vision for the whole world, all the nations worshiping Yahweh, very inclusive. So previously, there were exclusively Israelites, but inclusive of all gods. Now they become Yahweh exclusivists, but with an inclusive worldview of the whole world coming to worship. At least that's one strand of that. So that is the idea that they are going to that they had in mind. So 539, Cyrus took over. Cyrus, the Persian, took over the empire, and so the Persians, they have a different philosophy of how to manage the conquered people. He wanted the Persians wanted these conquered nations to go back to their own nations and to rebuild their own culture, as long as you pay tax, as long as you acknowledge the Persian king as the king of kings. So the Persian king he's not just the king, he's the king of kings, because the Persian idea is that there are going to be many local kings, right? There's going to be a king here, king there, king here, king there, but the king of Persia would be the king of kings. So that was the idea. So they sponsored all these people to go back to their nations, to rebuild their national temples and reestablish their national culture. And one of those who got to go back were the Jews. And that is why we have Ezra chapter 1 verse 1. All this to explain how we get to Ezra chapter 1 verse 1. And we have Sheshbazzar. We don't know much about him. He's just barely mentioned in the book of Ezra. And he brought some people to come back to Jerusalem, and we do not know what happened next. But then a few years later, we have a more detailed written Zerubbabel. It has a Babylonian name actually. Zerubbabel means planted in Babel, right? Planted in Babylon, because I think this is like his parents really listened to Jeremiah's instructions, right? To stay there, build houses, right? Raise your kids. So Zerubbabel, Jackie Chan's name is real name is Chen Gong-sang. Chen Gong-sang, because Gong-sang, 香港嘅港, born in Hong Kong, right? So basically, that's he's born in Hong Kong, right? Jackie Chan, born Hong Kong. So Zerubbabel planted in Babel like that, but ironically, he returns from Babel. So he brought with him. So he's kind of like, the reason why he's important is because he could trace his lineage back to David. So it gives you a lot of hope, isn't it? Now we have a son of David, right? A descendant of David, leading God's people back to Jerusalem. He has a partner, Joshua, who's a priest, potentially traceable back to Zadok, right? So a Zadokite priest and a son of David leading a group of people back to Jerusalem. So that's a big deal. And they try to build. When they go back, the first thing they build the altar. And there is a kind of if you read Ezra, there is a line that says that they came back to an empty land. Chronicles had the same kind of ideology, that it was an empty land. That the reason why the exile happened is so that to give the land rest, right? So there was nobody there at all. And so when they all come back, they had no problems at all. Each one just go back to, it was an empty land, right? Each one just go back to their own towns that their parents or their grandparents came from. But if you read carefully, you see that is not the case, right? We get Sanballat lah, we get like local people lah, right? So it wasn't exactly an empty land. The empty land is more of a theological idea, all right? That this land is something like Christopher Columbus discovered America. No, he didn't. People are believing in America forever. You know what I mean? The Native Americans has been there for forever, right? So that kind of a thing. So when they came back, they had run-ins with the locals who never left. The original Israelites, you understand? The original Israelites were still there, and these people, they come back from Babylon, but they had power because they had the imperial order that they are now in charge. So they came back, they wanted to build this temple. Then the local people say, wow, you guys came back from Babylon and you have a permission to rebuild the temple. Under the Babylonians, we wanted to rebuild the temple, but then we couldn't. First of all, we were the poor people, right? All the rich people got exiled. Number one, we were the poor people. Number two, the Babylonians didn't allow us to do that. Now that the king of Persia allowed us to do that, and you have come back and you brought all this money and all this precious material back, let's build the temple together. Zerubbabel said no. He's basically saying that anyone who didn't come back from Babylon, we don't consider them as a Jew anymore. Alright? First of all, who knows in the last 50 years who you mix with? We don't know. But at least in Babylon, we kept a meticulous record of who is whose son, right? So we're able to say who is whose son. Of course, you could write down who is whose son because you were the educated elite. But the people of the land who were left behind, they don't really care who the great-grandfather was, right? There isn't that, and maybe they're not as literate as well. So and furthermore, the local Israelites, they still worship other gods. They worship Yahweh, but they have other things as well. They got their own thing. So those who came back will say, you are the reason. You guys were the reason why we got exiled in the first place. So no thank you. You will have no part in rebuilding the temple with us. only those who came back from Babylon qualifies. Why? Because those of us who came back from Babylon, in that 50, 70 years in Babylon, we have developed an ideology. We have developed Judaism. So I have this book, very interesting book that I have been reading. Let me turn off the thingy. How do I turn off the thingy? Yeah. Judaism, the first phase, the place of Ezra and Nehemiah in the origins of Judaism, by Joseph Blenkinsop, who unfortunately passed away last week. Joseph Blenkinsop passed away last week. And as a historian of biblical studies, Old Testament studies, he traced the idea of Judaism. Where did it come from? It came not from the kingdom period, because the kingdom period was a mess, at least in the eyes of those who were in Babylon. So those in Babylon, they have developed a very, very specific form of interpretation of Israel's religion, and they have got all this scripture, right, that is now in very fixed form, more or less, and they come back and they say that only those who have what we have here belongs to us. Those who do not have what we are doing do not belong to us. Okay, so of course they met with opposition, right? Because if you build the temple, then you are in control of the place. So the local says, no, we're not going to let you to have control of the place. So they oppose the rebuilding of the temple. And so there was a lot of political maneuvers, and the people kind of also gave up on it and started to build their own houses, right? That is why we have the book of Haggai that says, oh wow, you guys are building your own houses, you're not building the temple, what's going on? And so Haggai and Zechariah rose up in the around 520 to have their prophetic ministry, and that stirred up the people to rebuild the temple. So the temple was rebuilt 516. Ezra comes back many decades later. So when you read the book of Ezra-Nehemiah, it's like, wow, next. But it's actually a long period of time that is being condensed into a short book. Ezra comes back. He is described as a scribe. So a scribe would be like part of the Ezekiel movement, you could say, that started in Babylon, right? The Ezekiel school of thought of Yahweh exclusivism. All our problems is because we have been syncretistic in our religion. So we need to come back to Yahweh and Yahweh alone. So that kind of ideology, Ezra, he came back to do a few things. One of it would be to teach the laws of Israel. And so we find in the book of Ezra Nehemiah, especially Nehemiah, we have the book of the law that Ezra read. What book would this be? Most likely it will be the book of Deuteronomy. Some say in some form or another. I think it's probably in its final form, Deuteronomy. And so when people read the book of Deuteronomy, then they realize, yes, this is why we were exiled. And then he has a problem. He found people, those who came back from Babylon, were intermarrying with the locals. Actually, these locals are mostly Israelites who never left. But because the Israelites who never left do not share the same religious views as those who came back from Babylon. So Ezra forced them as best he could. We read the text, you can see that it wasn't exactly successful. Why would he be? To get them to divorce their wives, because they are not part of our Babylonian colony. Basically, what they have done is that it is a reverse colonization kind of a thing. So I would say it's almost something like this in reverse. Most of us, ethnic Chinese Malaysians, we have been here for many generations before Merdeka, right? We have been here for many generations, and so we develop our own thing here, right? And now there is a new wave of people from China, right, coming to Malaysia. Are we the same people? you get it? Are we the same people? We have a completely different history, right? After the 1930s, we have a completely different history. We went through Malaysianization, right? We went through British rule, Malaysianization, Merdeka, and all of that. They went through Marxism. They went through Mao Zedong, Cultural Revolution, and all of that, right? And opening up Deng Xiaoping era. So we are very divergent, even if they come from the same kampung, right? You know what I mean? They come to the same kampung. They come to, so there will basically be, if they come here, they would be establishing, and they have been establishing, a parallel Chinese community, right? So there is a local Chinese community here, and there is kind of like a parallel Chinese community that the citizens of PRC, right, has come to Malaysia to establish their own community. So that's the kind of thing. For example, my grandfather, right, he's like spent a lot of time, he migrated from Guangzhou to Hong Kong before coming to Singapore. So if he had remained in Hong Kong, he would come to Hong Kong, and so when he came to Ipoh, etc. Now, and then 50 years later, right, today, more than that, but generations, 2 generations, my dad, me, and now people are migrating from Hong Kong because of the problems in Hong Kong. People are migrating away from Hong Kong, and Malaysia is a good choice for them because here people speak Cantonese. But when they come here, they will establish their own Hong Kong enclave, and they got this Hong Kong club that the Hong Kong people will join. And if I try to join and say, because my grandfather Hong Kong people, it doesn't work. Right? I can't join that community. You understand? So these Jews who come back from Babylon, they establish their and they replicate what they did in Babylon here in the land of Israel. So the headquarters is still kind of like Babylon. Babylon is still kind of like the headquarters, and from Babylon they keep on sending waves and waves of migrants. Every time they got a problem, they send a new wave. Every time they got a problem, they send a new wave, right? The Shen's Bazaar didn't work, nothing got done. They send a new wave, Zerubbabel. And send a new wave, Zerubbabel, they find that the people in not quite well versed with the Torah, so they send Ezra, right? And then later Nehemiah, right? So basically, anyone who comes from Babylon becomes the leader of that Babylonian Jewish community in Jerusalem, in the land of Israel. And everyone else, whether they're pure Israelites or mixed, would be excluded. 12 years later, Nehemiah arrived, and he was a governor. He was appointed governor. And that created a lot of tension in the local politics, because this is the governor that is appointed directly from Persia and comes from Persia, whereas Sanballat has been and his group has been gaining a lot of power, and Sanballat and the local chief priests, right, the Babylonian Jewish chief priests, right, they're like powerful families, and so they made marriage alliances. My grandson marry your granddaughter, that kind of thing, right, to cement. And Sanballat, he built a temple in Samaria. The idea is that he understands that the Babylonian Jews have come back and they have taken Jerusalem. There's no way to take Jerusalem back from these people, because these people had the approval of Persia, the king of Persia. So he tries to set up an alternative for the locals in Samaria, okay, at Mount Gerizim. So, okay, the Babylonian Jews, you can have Mount Zion. We're going to establish another temple, right, for the locals in Samaria at Mount Gerizim. And so his idea was that I'm going to marry into the high priestly family from Babylon, and that would give my descendants legitimacy to be priests in the temple in Mount Gerizim. You get that? Right? So that was the idea, and Nehemiah tried to put a stop to it. And if you read the last pages of Nehemiah, it seems that he had small success in that, but generally I think the people kind of ignored what he was trying to do to enforce Ezra's what Ezra did many years earlier, decades earlier. So clear as sky that what Ezra tried to do to get them to divorce their wives didn't actually work thoroughly. Otherwise, Nehemiah wouldn't have to come and do that again. There's always this intermarriage between the Babylonian Jews, the returnees, and also the local Jewish community. And eventually, all these things, the Persian Empire comes to an end with Alexander the Great, and they've got a new problem. The Hellenism became the dominant problems for the more stricter ones. So there's always this group of people who hold to a stricter ideology, the Ezekiel model, and there are these other voices who are a bit more flexible. And there are other groups who maintain that the nations will come to worship Yahweh. We're open to everybody, but as long as they pledge allegiance to Yahweh. As long as they pledge allegiance to Yahweh, they're part of us. I don't care whether they are Egyptians, whether they are Moabites, whether they're Edomites, don't matter, right? Egypt will be my people. Assyrian will be my son, right? That kind of idea. As long as let not the foreigner, Isaiah 66, let not the Isaiah 60 something, right? Let not the 60 something, let not the foreign 61, right? Let not the foreigner say that surely I'm cut off from the people. Let not the eunuch say surely I'm cut off from the people. As long as you observe the Sabbath, you offer your sacrifices will be accepted if you pledge wholehearted allegiance to Yahweh. So multiple strings of voice. So the Ezra-Nehemiah strand eventually in the Hellenistic period developed into what would eventually become the Pharisees. Right? And the Sanballat group develops into what eventually would be the Samaritans. And that became a big problem that Jesus had to sort it out, right? So Jesus had to sort it out, and that's the end of the story. Okay, I'm going to take a pause right here to see if you have any questions with regard to this historical recount.
Stephen, the Esther story
Yeah.
would be in between before Zerubbabel, right?
Yes. The story. No. The story itself will be after. Because we're talking about King Xerxes.
After, yes.
Yeah. So King
it's
yeah.
before the temple rebuilt, before
Somewhere here actually, after the temple was rebuilt,
after temple.
before Ezra. So Xerxes is here, Artaxerxes is here. So that will be that will be a testimony of the Jews never came back, right? And there is no inkling that they were very religious. If you read the book of Esther, there is no idea that they were actually Yahweh exclusivist religious at all. So instead of talking about Judaism, some scholars say it's better to say Judaisms because there are many ideas of how Israel ought to be. Yeah.
So as I think my study Bible says Esther is dated 483 to 473 BC.
Yeah, somewhere here.
483 to 473 BC.
Yeah, somewhere here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
The story, the setting of Esther, right? Well, when was it written is a different story altogether, right? The story of Esther is set in this period lah.
Which is the king Xerxes, which is before the king Artaxerxes.
Yeah. So
which-
Artaxerxes is Ezra-Nehemiah's time lah.
Yeah.
So the period of Ezra in the book of Ezra only begins from chapter 7.
Yes.
Yeah.
Chapter 1 to 6 is actually the Zerubbabel.
Zerubbabel.
Yeah.
And then after that, Ezra stayed back already in Jerusalem. That's why he was asked to read the book of the law in Nehemiah 12 years later, right?
We'll talk about that in a little bit. That is what the author wants to present. Historically, it will be quite a slightly different story. Yeah. The way it's presented is exactly the way you say, Woon. Yeah.
And these Sheshbazzar and Zerubbabel, they are different Jews in a sense.
Yeah,
Or
so-
some commentary says they're the same, right?
Sheshbazzar is the first wave.
Right.
Zerubbabel is the second wave of returnees. I think the difference between them is that the Sheshbazzar, when he came back, it's not easy for him to impose, right, that on the local population. But with Zerubbabel, he's something else. He's a real leader, and he has a more solid claim to leadership than Sheshbazzar, I suppose.
You could be explaining this later, but I'm interested to find out why the separation took place in the 8th and 9th century.
I have no idea. It's just the manuscript evidence, right? That means if we look at the manuscripts that we have, is that by the time somehow it is being transmitted as two separate books.
From my reading, it appears because the way Nehemiah begins.
Possibly.
It says, these are the words of Nehemiah. It's like a different book lah. But some people say it's like, part 1, part 2.
It's not the part. The reason why it's not is because the Jews themselves, they don't know that we separated books into two. Right? They will point. They will always have a marker, the Masoretes, to point to the middle of the book, and the middle of the book for them is, for us, will be somewhere in the middle of Nehemiah chapter 3 or something like that. So, but you're right that because of these are the words of Nehemiah, right? So that kind of begin a new section. But why divide into 2 books instead of 3 books, right? Why not have the book of Zerubbabel, the book of Ezra, and the book of Nehemiah? Yeah.
I think they want 66 books of the Bible rather than 65.
Yeah, it sounds like what my dad told me. Why the neck of the giraffe so long? Because the head is so far away. That's why you need to have a long neck to connect. Okay. All right. So that is a historical recount. So you need to know that biblical religion is actually a minority religion in Israel. But over time, especially due to the exile and what happens after the exile, it became more and more accepted as the religion that won, you can say, that won the day. Okay, so now we talk about the book of Ezra-Nehemiah. The main author of the book is neither Ezra nor Nehemiah, of course. That would be long dead by the time these all get published as the book that we have today, right? The book that we have today in its final form, it's a kind of like a historian sitting down, right, to write what happened in the past. And so, as any historian, you will need that sources, right? Where do you get this history from? So there is a part of the book, especially the book of Ezra, you will see Ezra talking in the first person, right? I did this, I did that, I did this, I did that. And there is another part in the book of Nehemiah where Nehemiah is speaking in the first person, and it's quite long, right? So it sounds like a first person kind of a retelling, a memoir. So for lack of better term, the scholarly term is Ezra memoir and Nehemiah memoir. So those are sources. Potentially, these two were put together. So they're edited separately, of course. Ezra memoir, and then Nehemiah's memoir. Probably somebody put them together, right? Because why would you copy them into different scrolls, right? I mean, it's just a waste of scrolls. So you copy them together into a single scroll as the memoirs. There are other sources that was available to our writer, which are the official documents. We have the decrees of the kings of Persia, what we call rescripts, because they were probably originally written in Persian, Aramaic alphabets, but it was rescripted into Hebrew alphabets, but it's still Aramaic, right? It's basically Hanyu Pinyin, right? It's basically rescripting the letters and the decrees into Hebrew alphabets, but the language is still Aramaic. And probably what was available to him as well were the lists, right? When we read the book of Ezra-Nehemiah, you get a lot of lists of names, quantities, right? Inventory of how many this, how many that, how many this, how many that. So this must have been preserved somewhere. For example, there's the list of the covenanters. I suppose the list of covenanters would have been preserved in the temple because it's a covenant. So those documents would be archived in the temple. So it seems that the author had access to all these things, and so he began to write. It's in 4 sections. Ezra 1 to 6, the main character is Zerubbabel. Ezra 7 to 10, the main character is Ezra. Nehemiah 1 to 7, the main character is Nehemiah. And then Nehemiah 8 to 13, Ezra and Nehemiah kind of like tag team, right? To do that. And so I'm gonna just have my Bible here, so I need to see. So what he did was then he basically, right, placed them into various places in his writing. So he's trying to synthesize them all, right? He's trying to write a story with his own input, of course. He's an author after all. So we see that we have chapter 1, right? So the author said, this, the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, etc., etc. He made a proclamation, and here's the proclamation. Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, right? So that's a decree. So he basically placed the decree there. He has all these things on top there of his sources. He placed it there, and then he has a inventory of stuff. Sheshbazzar brought 30 basins of gold, 1,000 basins of silver, 29 censers, 30 bowls of gold, etc., etc. Total 5,400, right? They brought. Okay. And then he has a list of returnees. Ezra 2, which is more or less the same list as Nehemiah 7. Alright, Nehemiah 7 and Ezra 2 is basically the same list. Some discrepancy in numbers, but more or less the same list. So then we have chapter 2, whereby we have the returnees. How many people. Interesting only for those doing a PhD in this thing. And then we have another inventory. We have how many camels lah, how many this one lah, verse 69, for example, of chapter 2. According to the ability, they gave the treasury of the work 61,000 direct of gold, 5,000 minas of silver, 100 priest garments. Okay, so he placed it there. And then after that, he has some stories that he tells about the rebuilding of the altar. And then we have a letter to King Artaxerxes written by the opponents, right? Written by the opponents, whom the commander and Shimshai the scribe wrote to Artaxerxes. And that's the content of the letter. Verse 11 tells us exactly that. This is a copy of the letter that they sent, right? So the author has access to an old letter right? That was written, that was there about a couple hundred years ago, I guess. Okay, and so then the king came back with a decree in verse 17, chapter 4, verse 17, came back with a decree, and then more letters. Tattenai write a letter to King Darius, and then King Darius came back with a decree in chapter 6. Okay, chapter 6, Tattenai the governor, and then the author tells a story of the temple, finishing the temple, celebrating Passover, and then chapter 7, Ezra was sent to teach, and Ezra came with a letter with a decree from the king. This is chapter 7, verse 11. This is a copy of the letter that King Artaxerxes gave to Ezra the priest, right? The scribe, a man learned in matters of the commandments of the Lord and his statutes. And so we have the letter of the decree of King Artaxerxes. That goes until the end of chapter 8. Okay, so chapter 8, right before chapter 8, verse 27, chapter 7, verse 27, we have the beginning of Ezra memoir. Blessed be the Lord, the God of our fathers, who put such a thing as this into the heart of the king to beautify the house of the Lord that is in Jerusalem, and who extended to me his steadfast love before the king and his counselors, and before all the king's mighty officers. I took courage, for the hand of the Lord my God was on me, and I gathered leading men from Israel to go up with me, right? So this is a first person account from Ezra's memoir, to be followed by another list of returnees in Ezra chapter 8, those who returned with Ezra, which is followed by more memoir, verse 15 onwards, chapter 8, verse 15, where Ezra sent for the Levites and then traveled to Jerusalem. And then we have the problem with the intermarriage. So the people confess their sin, and at the end there is a list of people who married foreign women. All right. So that's the end of the book of Ezra, where it ends with people had married foreign. This is the last verse of the book of Ezra. All these had married foreign women, and some of the women had even born children at the end. Alright, so that is how the book ended. So it started off like really gung-ho, right? Let's go back, rebuild the temple, but it ends with they married foreign women. Some of the women had even born children, like that. Strange book, huh? Then Nehemiah opens with Nehemiah's memoir, a very long memoir, a rather lengthy portion of the memoir. Chapter 1, verse 1, the words of Nehemiah, the son of Hakaliah, and it goes all the way down to chapter 1 and chapter 2. And then chapter 3, we have name list of who built the wall, right? Who's building, who rebuilt which part of the wall. I guess this list is also kept in the temple. That is why the author has access to it, because I think this is like, sponsorship list lah, something like that. Okay, so who did what, to immortalize that, and then followed by more Nehemiah memoir on the opposition to the rebuilding of the wall, and then Nehemiah did other things. Chapter 4, chapter 5, Nehemiah did other things, and eventually the wall was finished. And then when the wall is finished, we have another list of returnees, but it's the same list as the one that came back with Zerubbabel, but this time it is from the perspective of Nehemiah discovered Zerubbabel's list. Alright, Nehemiah discovered Zerubbabel's list, and it was repeated here, more or less. Then we have at the end an inventory, chapter 7, verse 66. How many silver, how many gold, how many singers, how many animals, more inventories. And then we have Ezra chapter 8, where Ezra reads the law. So here it seems like completely the work of the pen of the author, the pen of the writer. All right, we have from chapter 8, Ezra reads the law, and it seems that this part is a I have a the consensus seems to be, it seems to be that this chapter 8 of Ezra reads the law, was originally part of Ezra memoir, was supposed to be after chapter 7, after chapter 8, chapter 9 of the book of Ezra, but the author decided to cut that part out and put it here to time it with Ezra. There's a good reason. There's a good reason for it, because structurally there is a theological point that the author is trying to make. So he took that part of Ezra memoir and inserted it into chapter 8. So chapter 8 is Nehemiah chapter 8 is a bit of a dislocation from Ezra 7, Ezra 8 or Ezra 9, thereabout, being placed here. The reason is because without the reading of the law, you can't talk about the breaking of the law. What chapter 10, 11, 12 to 13 is trying to do is to tell how Israel broke the law, basically. And therefore, we have the reading of the law, then the breaking of the law. So, followed by a name list. We have a name list in chapter 10, which is a covenant. I suppose the covenant, the sealed documents are probably also placed in the temple. Then we have more name lists of chapter 11, chapter 12. Who's supposed to stay where, who's supposed to stay where. Then we have chapter 13, where Nehemiah's memoir continues, and it's a rather dark book, a dark chapter of the Bible, really. A little bit of commentary by the author, and that ends with Nehemiah's final part of his memoir. So as you can see, that the book of Ezra and Nehemiah was put together using many sources. So he's not just presenting the sources as they are, rather he is crafting a theological message out of the sources that he had. I'm going to do a second last pause here to see if any point of clarification that you want to make.
Stephen,
Yeah.
I saw a digression in in Ezra chapter 4, verse 6 to 23. You're aware of that, right?
Ezra chapter 4,
verse 6 to 23.
6 to 23.
This is very relevant for Anderson, who is speaking.
Okay.
I think he's not in our. Okay. So because you said a stop work order, right? That's the
Yes.
title of the sermon, right?
Yes.
So verse 1 to verse 5 then talks about the discouragement, right? And then it then jumps to, so verse 6 to 23 apparently is a digression, and it's more about Nehemiah's time. It's not about the
Yes,
temple.
because it's Artaxerxes. Yeah.
It's not about the temple, but it's about the walls. Verse 6 to 23 is a digression.
Yes.
And then verse 24 comes back to the problem they had.
Yeah.
Verse 4.
Yes.
Verse 4 and 5, yeah. Okay, correct, right?
Correct. But then the thing is that although you are right, but the author wants to present that Nehemiah part as a problem with the temple. You can see this in chapter 4, verse 24.
Yeah.
Right? Then the work on the house of God that is in Jerusalem stopped.
Yeah.
And it ceased until the second year of the reign of Darius, the king of Persia. So that
is like a pickup. The verse 24 is like a pickup from verse 5.
Yes. Yes. So So you're right. So what's going on here is that it seems that at least in my understanding, is that there was such a thing as the opposition to the rebuilding of temple. Otherwise, how are you going to explain what Haggai and Zechariah was doing? So that is clear evidence that there was such a thing, right? The temple was stopped. But I think probably the author don't have a source. Don't have a primary source, a letter, a stockwork letter, you know. Yeah. So what he did was that he dislocated a part of Nehemiah's memoir and placed it here to kind of represent it as
a temple problem, but it's not actually a temple problem because
yes.
It dated the.
So historically, the text is not a temple problem.
Yes.
But then the way the author is trying to talk about it is that this is how people have always opposed us, temple ka, wall ka, right? So he's representing it as opposition to the wall. He's representing it as opposition to the temple. But you're right to say that the text is originally about the wall, not the temple.
Okay, yeah. So we just have to make sure we know about the digression lah. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's less of a digression than taking. I mean, the text is about the wall. I mean, as in the memoir part is about the wall, but then the author is using it to talk about the temple.
Understand? Okay.
Yeah. So instead of a digression is let me tell you about the wall. He's not doing that. The author is saying let me tell you about the temple, but then using a text about the wall.
But then he's referring to different kings. He's referring to kings post. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean he's also being honest lah, but that his sources is actually a later source about Nehemiah.
Yeah. Okay. Understand.
Yeah.
And then the second point is the problems on the stalling of the temple construction or rebuilding is also partially explained in Haggai.
Yeah.
Haggai and Zechariah were trying to get people to start back the rebuilding.
Yeah.
And that's the part where we talk about you rather build your houses first before you build my house.
Yeah.
But that kind of problem isn't actually mentioned in Ezra, but I guess there needs to be a correlation with Haggai lah, huh?
Yeah, so I think what really happened was that there might have been a stop work order. As you can see, there isn't a source on the stop work order. The stop work order was on the wall.
But verse 4 and 5 suggest that it was not so much a stop work order, but the discouragement by those who were there.
Exactly. So what I'm saying is that although we're supposed to read it as though there's a formal stop work order on the temple, that's the way that we're supposed to read it. But then if you're asking me what actually happened historically, right? What actually happened historically is that there might have been some pressure, but then it's most likely it's like what you said, the people were bribing them, people were discouraging them, and then the people themselves also build this temple for what? Build our own houses first. That's why when you read Haggai, there's no inkling in Haggai that there was the king of Persia said don't build the temple.
Yeah, so possibly there was no such stop work order. It was more like spiritual discouragement.
Yeah.
That's why in chapter 5 of Ezra, when they found the spirit again to recommence the rebuilding, then the governor, Tattenai, the governor then questioned, why are you doing this? Do you have permission to rebuild?
Yeah,
he bring back, because this was like some years later, 16 years later, I think.
Yeah.
No, 520. Sorry, so they started the dedication. The dedication was in 538.
Yeah.
And then it was only in
537.
536. Sorry, dedication. The foundations, right?
Yes.
The foundations were 536, and then the recommencement is 520.
Yeah.
Then the completion of the temple was 516.
Yeah.
So that's why the governor Tattenai says, who said you can build again? I mean, who said you can build? Then they have to go and write letter to Darius, right?
Yeah.
That's the way to look at it. Okay, thanks.
Yeah. But that is, you're reading it historically. But if you're reading it literally, we are supposed to understand that there was an official opposition.
I see. Okay.
Yeah. Historically, is what's behind the text, the word, but the word behind the text is not the word of God. That's the
Yes.
The word of God is as it is right now lah. This part. So yes, you can say historically this text is about the wall, but then it has been applied to the temple by the author. So we'll use it lah.
Okay, understand.
Yeah,
But we remain unclear as to whether there was an official stop work order lah. Correct?
Yeah, I don't think there was.
Okay.
Otherwise, Haggai would have talked about it. Yeah.
Right, exactly. Okay, all right. Thank you.
Okay.
Stephen,
Yes.
Ezra, by the time he came in chapter 7, before that, chapter 6 shows the statement completion of the temple and the celebration and the dedication of the temple in chapter 6. Ezra chapter 6.
Yeah.
Right? Then after that, Ezra get all the benefits of gold and whatever support. It is also for the temple.
Yes.
So this reading by Ezra was the temple is already considered finished in chapter 6.
Yeah.
But chapter 7 is actually what all these things are just to make the temple better, nicer.
Yeah. So
And then after that, Nehemiah, by the time Nehemiah came, it is actually for the security of Jerusalem and the temple. Therefore, they built the wall. A temple finished. Then there was, to me, like maybe some improvement to the temple, embellishment to the temple, and then after that, the wall building. So Nehemiah was involved not in the temple but the wall building.
yes, yes. But so politically, the temple was more of a local dispute between hey, how can you build a temple without us, right? We have been here. We never even left. You guys left, and then you come back, you build a temple, and then you exclude us, right? So that was more of a local opposition. But the wall is a dangerous thing, because once you have a wall, you can defend it, right? Once you have a wall, you can declare independence, correct? So that is why Sanballat, wow, are you making yourself king? King Nehemiah, is that what's going on, right? So I'll tell the King of Kings, you can do that, right? So the wall was a much bigger problem than the temple in terms of politics. Yeah.
Stephen,
Yes.
Second Chronicles 36, the last chapter of Chronicles, ended with the decree of King Cyrus, right?
Yes.
And Ezra chapter 1 started with the same decree by King Cyrus. So, connection between Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles?
Oh, yeah, okay. So, some of the earlier scholars think that Ezra-Nehemiah was written by the chronicler. These days, scholars don't think so, but you're right in the sense that there's a lot of so therefore, why was there a need for Chronicles when we already have Samuel Kings?
Right.
Right? What's the need for Chronicles? Samuel Kings is written in the exile, so therefore it's very gloomy and dark, because it's to explain the exile. Chronicles is written after we've come back from exile, way after, and it is to fan some kind of nationalism, so the Kings is talking about how we failed. Chronicles is talking about how we can succeed again. So how we can succeed again is that we need to have a King David that is like a Superman King David. That's why you read the Chronicles, right? King David. There's even the story of David and Bathsheba in Chronicles. Whereas if you read Kings, First Kings, why did David do the census? Right? It's because he did the census. So who's responsible for the census? King David. But Chronicles, the blame is Satan. Satan is the one that is to be blamed for the census. So there is kind of an idealization of David in Chronicles, because it is to look forward to a future golden age that will be sparked by the Messiah, the son of David. So, and that is also the same kind of tone, or rather the same kind of period where Ezra-Nehemiah is penned. That is why Ezra-Nehemiah and Chronicles are very close in terms of their worldview, in terms of the ideology. Very different from the Kingdom period type of or the
But not necessarily the same authorship, I guess.
Nowadays people don't think that Chronicles, but they have the similar worldview enough that earlier scholars think that it's the same.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
18th century, 19th century scholars thought that they are written by the same guy. In fact, because there are two versions of Ezra's that we have. One is the one that is in our Bible. Another one is called First Esdras. First Esdras is still read in many branches of Christianity. In fact, the church fathers, when they quote Ezra, they don't quote our Ezra. They quote from First Esdras. So this story of Ezra, I guess this one we have it. I guess this one is in our Bible because we have it in the Hebrew. That one we no longer have it in the Hebrew. We have it in the Greek. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, right. So the prophetic expectation, and this is no. I have one more. Then we'll call it a day. Okay, so structurally, this is the interesting part, I suppose, in today's lecture. Structurally, it is in 4 sections. There is the Ezra chapter 1 to Nehemiah 7 is one unit. How do we tie the unit to the whole section together from Ezra chapter 1 to Nehemiah 7 is the list of returnees, forms the bookmark. Alright, list of returnees in chapter 2 and the list of returnees in Nehemiah 7 is the same list, more or less. Okay, and so that creates the bookmark of the returns. So Ezra 1 to Nehemiah 7 is about the returns. So Ezra 8 to 13 is something else. So if I'm to split the book in two, I will split the book into Ezra 1 to Nehemiah 7 and then Nehemiah 8 to Nehemiah 13 instead of Ezra 1 to Ezra 10, Nehemiah 1 to Nehemiah 13. You get what I mean? We can see that this is a coherent unit of literature, right? With being tied together by the two lists of returnees, which is the same list. So, and each of these then have 3 movements. There is a return, there is a revival, and there is the opposition with resolution. Okay, I put the resolution as the question mark. Is it really resolution? So remember what is our prophetic expectation. So if you are an Israelite, okay, you're reading this, you're reading the Bible canonically in the whole Bible wide, Old Testament wide, right? You're reading, you're following the story, Genesis, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, and then we ended up in exile. Oh no, we ended up in exile. But then there's this prophetic voice that says that once we come back, we're going to rebuild the temple. Yahweh is going to return to the temple. The nations will come to worship Yahweh, and then the Messiah. That kind of idea, isn't it? So that is the prophetic expectation. Ezra Nehemiah is going to tell you what's the reality. Okay, so this is what this book is about. This book is about, there is a prophetic expectation that a general reader of the Bible will have, but then Ezra and Nehemiah is going to give you the cruel reality. Okay, so first we have Zerubbabel return, right? Sheshbazzar, the one don't count lah. We have Zerubbabel, he returns by edict of King Cyrus, and the job is to rebuild the temple. And there was a revival, right? There's a rebuild the temple, there's a dedication, and all of that. But then there's all these. So in music, there's a bit of a minor key throughout. There's a so it starts off in the major key, all right? That says that we come back, we brought back things, we brought back people, we brought back temple vessels, gold, silver. Hallelujah! And then we built, and then we cheered, and then there's a minor key. Those who were older, who saw the original temple, wept because it's not as great as the first one. Okay, so instead of golden age, So the prophetic expectation, we go back to Jerusalem, is going to be golden age. We're going to be greater than what we once was. But then the minor key goes in and says that actually we're worse off than before. All right. And then we have the opposition from the locals, and Zerubbabel rejected the people of the land. They are called the people of the land, Am Haaretz, to jointly build the temple. So then what happens to Isaiah 66, Isaiah 11, the nations come to worship Yahweh? What happens to that, right? So they return to Jerusalem, yes. They rebuild the temple, yes. Yahweh returned the temple, nope. Such that by the time of Malachi, the priests were just like, I don't know what we're doing, right? The priests like saying, we don't know what we're doing. Because there's nothing here. There's no reality. There's no Ark of the Covenant. There is no glory of the Lord. It's an empty religion. So you offer what also can lah. You offer lame sheep, blind sheep, what also can, right? So that is the book of Malachi, right? And then the nations come to worship Yahweh. No, the Messiah. Is Zerubbabel the Messiah? Nope. So it kind of ends in the kind of like, you rejected the people of the land to jointly build the temple. Is that the right thing to do? Is that the wrong thing to do? All we can say is that Zerubbabel was sincere. He was honest. He was definitely upright. But it's just that, it seems to not meet the prophetic expectation. So we need a new wave. So a new wave with Ezra, Artaxerxes. And it is to bring offerings, right, to beautify the temple, and also to teach the Torah. But the teach the Torah part was dislocated to Nehemiah 8. And then, instead of all nations come to worship God, what we have is divorce the local women. Right? Divorce the Samaritans. And this put the animosity between the returnees and the local Samaritan population became really solidified in this era. Is that the right thing to do? So it makes you question, right? Is that the right thing to do? And then we have a third return. Nehemiah comes back to rebuild the wall, and there's a revival, the rebuilding the wall of Jerusalem. And you can see the grit that Nehemiah, they're all sincere people. All loyal to God, right? Serving the Lord wholeheartedly. But then you get these question marks that you wonder, rejected working, you shall have no part with us in Jerusalem. You shall have no part with us in this city. You shall have no part in us. This thing is repeated several times. You shall have no part in us. So it creates the kind of animosity that we eventually find in the gospel. Basically, right? In the gospel, we find all the problems stems from this era. Okay, then we have the final part where we have Ezra and Nehemiah coming together to talk about, to teach the covenant, to teach the Torah, the reading of the Torah, and there was repentance, there's settlement. So, but then it is followed by chapter 13, whereby the temple was the temple was kind of like disregarded. If you read Nehemiah chapter 13, verse 4, it says, "Now before this, Eliashib the priest was appointed over the chambers of the house of our God and was related to Tobiah." Tobiah was supposed to be an outsider, but he's not an outsider. Hello, his name is Tobiah. The Yah there stands for Yah. You know, he's a Jewish man. But then because this guy never got exiled to Babylon, I don't care lah. Your name is Tobiah ka or whatever ka. All right, a good Jewish name. No, you are considered outsider. Preferred to Tobiah a large chamber where they had previously put the grain offering, etc. he said that this is the reason why this happened is because he was not in Jerusalem. He went back to Babylon, and then when he came back to Jerusalem, he discovered the evil that Eliashib had done for Tobiah, preparing for him a chamber in the courts of the house of God. I was very angry, and I threw out all the household furniture of Tobiah out of the chamber. Then I gave orders, and I cleansed the chambers, and I brought back the vessels of the house of God with the grain offering and the frankincense. What about the Levites? Well, I also found out that the portion of the Levites had not been given to them, so that the Levites and the singers who did the work had fled each to his field, because the tithe weren't coming. Right? The tithe, we read this in the book of Malachi, right? Bring the full tithe. Why are you shortchanging the Levites? So the Levites couldn't serve in the temple because they couldn't maintain their own livelihood. So they went back to farming. So we see that verse 4 to 14 is just this. The temple just becomes decaying, right? The temple practice is decaying. What about the Torah and the wall? So the first part of the temple, then we have Torah. Well, verse 15. In those days, I saw in Judah people treading wine presses on the Sabbath. People were bringing in heaps of grain, loading them on donkeys, also wine, grapes, figs, all kinds of loads, which they brought into Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. So the Sabbath wouldn't be followed. So, as though everything Ezra did was in vain. Okay. What about the wall? Verse 19. As soon as it began to grow dark at the gates of Jerusalem before the Sabbath, I commanded that the doors should be shut and gave orders that they should not be opened until after the Sabbath. And I stationed some of my servants at the gates, that no load might be brought in on the Sabbath day. Then the merchants and sellers of all kinds of wares lodged outside Jerusalem once or twice. But I warned them and said to them, why do you lodge outside the wall? If you do so again, I will lay my hand on you. So the wall is being compromised, turned into pasar malam, right? So each of these themes, all right, we see. So we have a revival of the temple, but that ended up in regression of the temple. We have a revival of the Torah and the wall, and then we have the regression of the Torah and the wall. And finally, the problem that of the divorce of not divorcing the local women, marrying local women, creeps into here also more intermarriage. And not only that, we have verse 28. And one of the sons of Jehoiada, the son of Eliashib the high priest, was the son-in-law of Sanballat. So the high priest married his grandson to Sanballat's daughter. Sanballat was Nehemiah's enemy, was the Samaritans. So he saw a problem with marrying the Samaritans, whereas the high priest didn't thought was a problem. Therefore I chased him from me. Remember them, O God, because they have desecrated the priesthood and the covenant of the priesthood of the Levites. And that's how roughly the book of Ezra-Nehemiah ends. It's just that we have all this prophetic expectation, but it was a revival that never was. And biblically, as in canonically, reading the Bible as a whole, when you read this part, they go, we need a new revival. Okay, this revival, it starts off good. Everyone was sincere, but something is lacking. We need a new revival. What is the new revival about? Yes, we have returned to Jerusalem. We have rebuilt the temple. But this is what we need for a full restoration, for a full return from exile. All right? So that is why the Jews still considered that during Jesus' time, still considered themselves to be in exile, spiritually in exile. We have come back physically, we have not come back spiritually, because Yahweh has not returned to his temple. the nations have not come to worship Yahweh, and there's no Messiah. So it was a revival that never was, and so there's a need for a new revival, and that, of course, is fulfilled in Jesus Christ. So that is the function of Ezra and Nehemiah in the story of the whole Bible. So I guess what I'm anchoring is this. We can have all ideas about rebuilding, revival, everything, okay? Even with honest, sincere men, okay, it would just be the revival that never was. What you need is the Messiah, the Holy Spirit, the presence of the Lord. Then there will be a new revival. Then there will be a full rebuilding and a complete revival, right? And so that is how to read the book of Ezra and Nehemiah. Okay. Whew. All right. So that's that. Let's have one final round of discussions. Then we call it a day. Next week we will go into week by week, sermon by sermon kind of a overview.
So next week is important that we get those
The preachers.
will come by lah.
There are definitely.
Yeah. Okay. Anything else?
Yep. Packet, go ahead.
Trying to I do the text first, and then I do the devotional part. Asking about the devotional part, taking off from what you just ended with. So I'm just trying to crisscross Ezra and Nehemiah where they intersect. So I saw that one where that chapter 4, that what I call that inverted commas now digression, it's where there's a crisscross with Nehemiah. So I wanted to ask the question, and then I'm aware of the timing because Ezra comes on the scene 458 BC. Sorry, I'm just being chronological. I know there's a historical, it may not be the way the writer or the compiler wanted to put it out because he has a spiritual objective. But just trying to make sure I know how to read the sequences. So 458 BC, Ezra come on the scene. 444 BC, Nehemiah arrives in Jerusalem.
Is it 446?
444. Okay, I think there's some debate there, 1 or 2 years difference, but he probably that message that came from his brother was about 445 because of the way they talk about each year of the reign.
Oh yeah.
So 14 years later, Nehemiah comes in to Jerusalem 14 years after Ezra has been doing his ministry, right? And then the wall is rebuilt in 52 days, right? And then so in 444 October 444 BC, the wall is rebuilt. And then we have this reading, of the law that is the next, which is in chapter 8, after the list of returnees you mentioned, right?
Yeah.
It's like a flashback for Nehemiah because he's flashing back right into the original returnees with Zerubbabel, right? And then he picks up the story again with the reading of the law at the Watergate Square. And that's with Ezra. Okay. So, and then from there is a confession and a covenant made, right? Which is chapter 9 and 10. So I'm just trying to see whether that episode is linked to chapter 9 and 10 of Ezra, where there is a confession of sin, but there's this particular sin of intermarriage. But I think this particular sin of intermarriage isn't particularly mentioned in that confession in chapter 9 and 10 of Nehemiah. And then the next thing that happens chronologically is 12 years late after coming. So about 433 BC, Nehemiah goes back because he told the king, I'll come back. Because the king said, when will you come back? I let you go, but when will you come back? And so he finished his governorship in Judah. And then he went back to Artaxerxes in 433 BC. This is mentioned as a post-log in chapter 13 of Nehemiah, right? But then he comes back again to Jerusalem, and then he finds the same sins repeated. And that's when he mentions the intermarriage as well, as one of the sins that he discovered when he came back again to Jerusalem to be the governor a second time. So I'm trying to link or whether maybe it's not even linked. Maybe the sin that Ezra found in chapter 9 and 10 of Ezra, where there was also a confession, it's a different episode altogether. Or I guess we don't have to be exactly sure. But whether you see any linkage between the sin that Ezra identified in chapter 9 and 10 of Ezra as linked with the confession in chapter 9 and 10 of Nehemiah, or is it the sin of chapter 13? But that's quite far already, so Ezra must be quite old already. by 433 BC.
So that is why most scholars would think that Ezra 8 is a dislocation Nehemiah 8 is a dislocation from Ezra 8. Now, I think the dislocation is to create this text whereby there is this very nice sections, and then the diagram that I draw, right, is to create that kind of a theological thingy, and it's not anything new. You have already identified. He moved Nehemiah up to Ezra chapter 4, right, and things like that. So, if you read carefully, how Ezra chapter 8, it can be a bit awkward. We have here.
Nehemiah chapter 8.
Sorry, Nehemiah chapter 8. Oh my goodness.
Okay. Yep.
All right. So it can be a bit awkward. You see that Ezra was reading in verse 3. He was reading the Torah before the water gate from early morning until midday. Okay?
Right.
So he was reading. But then verse 5, and Ezra opened the book in the sight of all the people, for he was above all the people, and as he opened it, all the people stood.
Right.
Then, verse 7, we have Joshua, a bunch of people, help the people to understand the law, while the people remain in their places. They read from the book, from the law of God clearly, and they gave the sense so that the people understood the reading. So in verse 3, he was reading. In verse 5, he was opening the book. so there is a bit of a awkwardness. He's reading, and then he opens the book. Right? Verse 3, he reads. Verse 5 opens the book. Why is it like that one? Why shouldn't he open the book first, then only reread? Why is it he read first, then only he opens the book? And then verse 9, Nehemiah, who was the governor, and Ezra, the priest and scribe, and the Levites who taught the people, said to all the people. And you can see that here, the language is also slightly awkward. So the original could have probably read, Ezra said to all the people, this day is holy to the Lord your God. Do not mourn and weep. But because we are now in chapter 8, it's possible that the author added the word and Nehemiah, who was the governor. There was really no reason so late in the book of Nehemiah to tell us that Nehemiah was the governor. We already know he's the governor from the very start. So, you know what I mean? So if I say Ismail Sabri the prime minister, I would say that in chapter earlier, right? So then why chapter 8 you get Ismail Sabri the prime minister? So it seems to be a kind of a insertion, if you will. So this could have been a dislocation from Ezra's memoir. Ezra read the law, but because the writer placed it in Nehemiah 8, all right, so to make the story flow, put in Nehemiah was there also lah. Nehemiah and Ezra did this together. So that we can get Ezra out of the way and talk about how Nehemiah pull people's hair lah, things like that, right? So the story was actually about the story of Nehemiah. But then you cannot talk about how people broke the law without telling people need to know the law first. So they saw the need for the reading of the law, then they broke the law, right? So Ezra reads the law, then they broke the law. But then they cannot say Nehemiah read the law. It just doesn't make sense because, Nehemiah is a layman. What do you mean by he read the law? It must be Ezra the scribe who read the law. So if you read the book of Ezra, the king sent Ezra to do two things: to beautify the temple and to read the law. But he never read the law until here in chapter 8. So probably it should be he beautified the temple, he read the law. That is how the sequence was. And then the author took his sources and rearranged it a little bit to create a theological message. Yeah, that would solve the why like this one, like this one. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Yeah.
So the author wasn't trying to write history. People already know the history. He's trying to promote, in modern parlance, he's trying to advance an ideology.
Yeah. It's just that we get confused what happened first, and
That is why this book is don't do a PhD on this one. It's just
And then from the
I
spiritual.
think shall we stop? It's already 5:30. I just want to respect our commitment to a time to finish by 5. Maybe you can pick it up separately with Stephen R. So for the others, if we could just maybe get Woon, could you close us with a word of prayer? Thanks.
Let's pray. Father, thank you for this afternoon session. Thank you, Lord, for the richness of your word and for the understanding that is given to us, Lord, as you speak to our brother Stephen. We thank you for the good overview, and we just continue to glorify you, Lord, with the privilege of knowing you and knowing your ways. And so, Lord, we just want to commit ourselves to you and all the speakers that will be joining us also next week, that, Lord, we will be excited, Lord, to declare what your word had to say, and that in all of our studies, Lord, we see your glory and what attitudes in men, in our hearts, in our lives, that you desire to form in us. So we want to pray, Lord, that in all this knowledge, we may just do well to see the transformation in every life that's in our assembly who listens to your word. Thank you for this afternoon. We thank you and pray that we all may have a very good worship tomorrow. We give you thanks in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you. Thanks, Stephen.
Man, thanks.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye, Joel.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, bye, Joel.
It's a big
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Stephen. It was really, really good.
really a big burden off my shoulder right now.
Okay. So get all the speakers to be present next Sunday, next Saturday.
Okay.
All right.
Okay, bye-bye.